It's really getting clear. You can see the intersections even with what Vicki said too, and how these all overlap. Next, I'm going to pass it to Debbie, and she's going to focus on SRHR and how that intersects with the two previous, little mini presentations. Also, I'll just pass it to you.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. For those who missed the introduction, I'm Debbie Owusu Akeeyah, I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-director of policy and advocacy at Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. We work nationally and globally advancing SRHR, and I'm happy to be here to talk about my favorite topic, access to reproductive health care. So, I don't know how many folks here are based in Canada. I'm going to show of hands of folks who are not. Okay, because I asked that because I do not want to be reiterating information you folks might not know, but I'm going to try my best to make sure that I share things that will apply to folks across multiple borders. Canada really prides itself in its public healthcare system, and I think it's important to frame that. Within the Canadian Health Act, access to things like abortion is integrated in it. We don't have an abortion law where other countries do that make it prime for attacks. It is within our healthcare system. And since 1995, but also since abortion was decriminalized in our country, the biggest issue has remained access. Canada's a very large country, size-wise. Population-wise, we're getting there. But size-wise, it's a very large country. And what has been shown over the last 30 years is that if you live in northern BC, or if you live in Toronto, your ability to access adequate SRHR is going to vary. That kind of defeats the universality of the healthcare system that we really pride ourselves in. And it really defeats the feminist fight that my foremothers and sisters and comrades in this movement have fought for us to have a universal healthcare system that women and other gender diverse folks can see themselves in. And so this remains the biggest issue that we see right now. How I kind of frame it though, anytime a doctor gets past that stigma around providing abortion care, or a doctor gets trained on being able to insert an IUD, or a midwife is able to support someone across the whole spectrum of their SRHR journey, that is a win. And these are wins that we've been able to claim. However, there are still challenges that are tied to stigma, and I won't go into too much of a lecture, but I want to talk about the far-right backlash that continues to exist in Canada culturally and politically, that continues to feed into the access issues that we see across the country. The pandemic, and COVID-19 is mentioned throughout I forget the name of the report now, it's very early in the morning. The Missed Opportunity Shadow Report has exposed multiple gaps across varying sectors that women's rights activists work in, and healthcare is one of them. It exposed the inequities around access to a family doctor for a variety of people, but it also exposed and presented an opportunity, unfortunately, for privatization to insert itself throughout the entire country. I don't know for the Canadian-based folks who are here, Alberta is going through it right now, exposing the issue around privatization and what that actually means when it comes to access to SRHR. This is something that is a risk for us across the entire country. And Vicki mentioned the new liberal leader, who is like the king of neoliberalism. The things that we're gonna need to pay attention is when we move away from language around universality to language like, for those who need it, which was in his speech on Sunday when he won the leadership race. Because that impacts the policies that we've been fighting for that are key to eliminating access issues when it comes to SRHR. Some two major wins in particular that I think are really important for us to celebrate are one, Bill C-64 on the Universal Pharmacare Act, which is gonna start off by ensuring, let's clap for that. It starts off by addressing two drug classes. That's diabetes drugs, and then it's free contraception. And as of today, we have 3 provinces who've signed on to the Pharmacare Act. We have BC, Manitoba, and PEI. So yes, another celebration. But there are obviously a lot more provinces and territories that we need to continue to push for. The other policy area that is a win for us is the Sexual and Reproductive Health Fund, which has been able to fund and support not only Action Canada's work. We run a very high demand access line that connects multiple clients to the SRHR needs across the country, whether that's access to an abortion or even just critical information that's needed for them across their journey. But it also funds sexual health centers that are locally based, that are part of our communities, that are key to ensuring that we thrive. And the issue with the neoliberalism piece is when our progressive policies are then seen as like excess and not as equally important to the economy. My friends, they are. Strong economies require strong progressive policy, and it's feminists who are at the forefront of ensuring that we have those. So funding things like sexual health centers, who are there to support the victims of sexual violence and the survivors of sexual violence, and are also there to support them in accessing things like an IUD when they're at risk of sexual coercion and reproductive coercion of a partner. It's key information around access to things that are not even covered in the in our pharmacare bill, like condoms, which some people like to use. These things are key and important, but they are at risk of being lost as things have completely changed with tariffs, Trump, and this backlash culturally away from progressive policies. And so when I think about where we are at right now and what we need to continue to do, regardless of who ends up leading Canada, we need to make sure that people still support popular, progressive, feminist policies. Because this is going to be, thank you, because this is going to ensure that our healthcare system, writ large, is going to remain strong and public and universal. It's going to push back against these corporations and big pharma who are trying to put a price tag on something that's key, and that is a human right, which is our access to healthcare. But it's also going to push back on a very vile and insidious and well-funded backlash that doesn't want to see people like us in this room having these type of conversations. And so the fight is intersectional, which is very, very key. A fight for public health care is a fight for us to have housing access. A fight for public health care is a fight for us to be able to work in jobs where we feel safe. And that is where we're at and what we need to continue to do. And I'm glad to do so alongside some really awesome feminists.
Thank you, Debbie. And so last but not least, just for this segment, is Ingrid Green. And she's going to talk about Indigenous women's rights and how that intersects across the critical areas.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, panelists. Amazing. I've been invited to frame my discussion around Indigenous women's rights and our sacred relationship with the land, water, and all our relations, and our roles as land and water stewards and defenders. Yesterday, I had the honor of co-hosting a parallel event with Indigenous women from the Maori Women's Welfare League and from the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Women's Alliance. We spoke about the need for dedicated space within the UN system by and for Indigenous women. We did this because our voices, our experiences, our solutions, and our rights are being ignored. I have spoken a few times this week already about the blatant disregard of Indigenous women through the Beijing Plus 30 review process, including this CSW 69 session and the regional meeting I participated in last fall. I'd like you to consider a few things. The CSW 69 session focused on the Beijing Declaration, a platform for action, and is often hailed as one of the most progressive blueprints for achieving gender equality internationally, fails to include a focus on Indigenous women and our rights, and doesn't include any formal mention of the Beijing Declaration of Indigenous Women. Consider also that the CSW 69 political declaration that was just adopted yesterday includes just one reference to Indigenous women. The zero draft had zero. Our experiences are overlooked within terms such as rural women, civil society, all women, or stakeholders. And consider how there has never been a CSW priority theme on the empowerment and rights of Indigenous women. If this CSW 69 session and the Beijing Plus 30 review process are the measure of where we're at, then we have a long way to go. But it's not all bad. We have made some progress, the majority of which has been achieved through the tireless grassroots efforts of Indigenous women. Since the Fourth World Conference on Women, the Indigenous women's movement has achieved significant milestones, both in Canada and internationally. In Canada, we've seen the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples explicitly identify colonialism as a root cause of violence against Indigenous women and girls. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report set out 94 calls to action to redress the harms caused by ongoing colonization. And the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and 2S Plus peoples included 231 calls for justice. Internationally, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples establishes a global standard for the protection of Indigenous peoples' rights worldwide. And CRIAW General Recommendation number 39 is specifically on the rights of Indigenous women and girls. Yet despite the momentous national and international policy achievements, Indigenous women are still not safe, and our inherent rights continue to be undermined both in Canada and worldwide. Upholding our rights is a critical area requiring immediate action, and we certainly have a long way to go when it comes to respecting our sacred relationship with Mother Earth. 30 years ago, the Indigenous women who drafted the Beijing Declaration of Indigenous Women critiqued the very premise that Indigenous women's rights can be upheld by a structural system built upon colonization and demands for economic growth through recolonization, Indigenous peoples' marginalization, and the perpetual destruction and exploitation of Mother Earth. Today, the global shift towards a green economy and alternative energy sources have fueled the extraction of resources needed for green technologies, including critical minerals from our lands. As a result, our lands and waterways continue to be ravaged by mining corporations and extractive industries, and the Indigenous land defenders who protect Mother Earth from exploitation and assert their rights to free, prior, and informed consent face criminalization, surveillance, and violence. Resource extraction activities perpetuate the circumstances through which Indigenous women and girls experience heightened vulnerability to human trafficking and other forms of race and gender-based violence. The increasing frequency of climate-related disasters demonstrates the unsustainability of economic systems which incentivize high levels of resource consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. The climate crisis threatens our green cultural practices, our medicines, and our ceremonies, which are inextricably connected to our lands and our waters. As water carriers, Indigenous women are uniquely impacted. This is the current reality, but here's what we can do about it. Indigenous women's voices must be centered in all action related to Mother Earth, climate change, and environmental justice. We hold important knowledge for both migration and adaptation. In Canada, this means governments must hold Indigenous women's leadership rights by implementing a nation-to-nation, distinctions-based plus approach to engagement, policy, and funding models that ensure Indigenous women are informed, involved, consulted, and benefit from resources being allocated to address environmental racism, climate change, and protect Mother Earth. We need to see long-term sustainable funding to Indigenous women and our organizations leading work to restore our relationship with Mother Earth. We need all governments to protect and not criminalize Indigenous women's voices, perspectives, and leadership as defenders of Mother Earth. Canada must ensure Canadian extractive industries operating abroad and within Canada are held accountable for human rights violations against Indigenous women, human rights, and land defenders. And there's lots that we can do together to hold government accountable, which I will talk about in the next part of today's discussion.